This is the last and final video for Chapter 33, The Great Depression and the New Deal. So we left off talking about the Supreme Court and how Roosevelt's whole court-packing plan gets struck down, but it ends up turning out well for Roosevelt as decisions start to go for him, as one justice kind of starts changing his decisions, and a lot of the justices over 70 start to retire, and so he'll get to appoint a couple new justices. Now during this time, because of the Wagner Bill, which had been accused of being unconstitutional but got found constitutional by the Supreme Court, we're going to see the rise of labor unions. And they're going to go from about 10% membership of all workers in an industry to about 35%, which means more people are unionized, which leads to more strikes. Now we're going to have the foundation of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO. So the Congress of Industrial Unions is founded in about 1835, and it's a federation of industrial unions, which means that a bunch of different industrial unions, so like the Automobile Union and the Steel Workers Union, are going to join together in order to have better bargaining power. They kind of split off of the AFL, which we've talked about before, and they become a rival to the AFL. The CIO, which is what we call the Congress of Industrial Organizations, supports FDR. Unlike the AFL, they are open to African Americans, and they're going to grow very rapidly during the Great Depression. Eventually, they will rejoin with the AFL in 1955, creating the AFL-CIO, which is what we have today. They have a big office building in downtown DC, you might if you've driven by it. And they're going to be instrumental in increasing union membership. Now, we're also going to see a bunch of strikes in the automobile and steel industries. Now, Roosevelt, unlike other presidents, is going to stay out of it. He lets them fight it out on their own. And in fact, when strikes are happening, Roosevelt is on the West Coast and doesn't even comment on it, which is totally different from all of the other presidents before him who had gotten involved in some aspect. But we are going to see during his presidency that the Fair Labor Standards Act is passed, which has a minimum wage of 40 cents per hour. That's not much, but it's the first baseline minimum wage for a 40-hour work week, and anything over 40 hours becomes known as overtime. Also, finally within U.S. history, we outlaw child labor. Remember, Wilson had tried to do it, but Wilson's Child Labor Act had been struck down as unconstitutional. The Child Labor Act under the Fair Labor Standards Act is going to hold. So child labor is done. Today, if you're under 16, you have to have a work permit. You can only work certain hours of the day for a certain amount of time. There's all sorts of regulations relating to that. Now, this Child Labor Act only affects children in industrial labor. If you work on a farm and your dad says get outside and work on the fields, your child labor laws don't apply to them, but it means children are not working in factories anymore. So that's going to be a big deal with the Fair Labor Standards Act. That leads us into the last phase of the New Deal. In this last phase, and this is something really important to understand, we're going to see a huge recession within the confines of the Great Depression. So we're talking about this little rise in unemployment right here between July of 1937 and June of 1938. What ends up happening is that when Roosevelt becomes president in 1933, unemployment was about 28%, roughly a third of the population. But in 1937, unemployment is only about 13 to 14%, so it's been cut dramatically, mainly with things like the Work Progress Administration and things like that. And Roosevelt says, looks like everything's really good, let's let private industry take back over and back off the idea of spending on deficit, balance the budget, and take the government money out of the workplace. Let the businesses run things on their own. So Roosevelt takes government money out of the workplace, he pulls it back, he turns off the money flow, and the economy spirals downwards. The unemployment rate goes from about 13 to 14% back up to 25% in just a matter of months. So this becomes known as the Roosevelt recession. And Roosevelt is basically to blame for it, for taking the money back out. Now everyone's asking what's happening, and Roosevelt replies that according to this new economic theory from a guy named John Maynard Keynes, you have to let the economy get back on stable footing before you can pull money out. Okay, and so what ended up happening is Roosevelt thought the economy was stable and he could pull the money out, and it turns out it wasn't as stable as he thought. So he pulls the money out and everything spirals down. Eventually it'll come back, work back up. But what is Keynesian economics? The way that it goes is that under the Keynesian economic theory, in a time of depression or recession, you have to have government spending, which means you have to have deficit spending, which means spending the money you don't have. And where do you get the money? Well, you borrow it, maybe from other countries, maybe you print more money, things like that. So today, under the Keynesian economic theory, in 2008, we passed a stimulus bill when our economy dipped of about $800 billion that we borrowed from China. And this money went to creating projects that would provide jobs for people and things like that. So the government has to come in and spend money to prop up the industries until they are able to stand back up by themselves. And the analogy that they used in the 1930s is called priming the pump. Now, chances are you guys don't have a well out back, so you don't have to go prime the pump, but here's how it works. With a well, in order to get water out of a faucet that's connected to the well, you have to press down on the faucet, and it would be like a handle that you would pump up and down. And you have to get all of the air out, and after pressing the handle for a couple different times, water would eventually come out, and then the water will flow freely. So Keynesian economic theory says that the government has to spend money to prime the pump, to get all the bad stuff out of the economy, like getting the air out, until finally the water flows again and private industry can take back over. Then the government can step back and increase their revenue and take that money to pay off the deficit. Now, Keynes is saying that you don't worry about your deficit when there is a recession or depression. You worry about the deficit after the economy has been stabilized. And so the idea today with our government and the whole budget issue is Congress is saying that our economy has stabilized, and the president seems to be saying that it's not quite stabilized, that we don't need to worry about the deficit as much. And so Congress is saying that we need to basically stabilize the budget. And that's why there's this whole fight in Congress over the deficit, because it's increased so much. At what point do we start paying that back off and pull government money back out of the economy, and when do we keep it back in? That's one of the big fights today. So in the 1930s, when the Roosevelt recession happened, Keynes says that Roosevelt was not spending enough. You need to spend more. You don't take your foot off the gas until the economy has recovered. And so that's kind of what we're doing today. It's much more of a political fight today about the deficit, but it's usually a political fight for the minority party. So the Republican argument today is that we're building a debt that our children will have to pay off, and the Democrats argue that we need to spend more until our economy is stable, and then we can get out. That the Democrats are saying our economy is not stable yet. The Republicans are saying that we can't do deficit spending to begin with. So Keynesian economics tends to be more of a democratic idea today. But at the same time, you can reverse it. During President Bush's years, George W. Bush, we had 2 wars and we saw the national debt double. And in an interview with Vice President Cheney during that term, they asked about the deficit, and he said that it doesn't matter. Okay, but it was a big deal with the Democrats during that time period. So deficits always end up mattering to the minority party. And we'll see if in 2016, if it's still a fight, whether it becomes, if Republicans take back over the presidency, whether that becomes an issue of the Democrats, and how that changes. So deficits matter to the minority party. The deficit had increased under a variety of presidents. Surprisingly, it had tripled under Reagan. It had doubled under President W. Bush. And it's on pace to triple under President Obama. So it's not a new fight. It's been going on since the 1930s. So that's Keynesian economic theory. When this little recession happens, FDR is going to throw the government back into the economy in the late 1937, early 1938, to get it stabilized, and pulls unemployment back again. So that's when we start to see this area scoop back down. We never fully get out of the Great Depression until what happens? World War I. When we start building up for World War I and people start buying our stuff, even before we, the United States, get involved in the war, when it begins with Hitler in Poland in late 1938, our unemployment is still about 16%. And so Roosevelt was able to cut our Great Depression in half, but he didn't end the Great Depression during this time period. So that's kind of what's happening with the Great Depression. It's not going to end until the war begins, which is going to be the next chapter. Now, switching to life during the Depression. Life during the Great Depression was very tough for women, more so for women, because a lot of men are going off looking for jobs, so they're leaving their families behind. Some women are abandoned and have their husbands just leave to try and find a job and send money back home. Some men leave and never send money back home. If women do find a job to try and keep the family afloat. They're going to be paid a lot less than men. So they have added responsibilities with the family and with dealing with money to keep the family going. You can add to that problem by having a minority woman who has it even worse than everybody else. Women are going to be accused of taking men's jobs. They're going to be accused of working for low wages. We're going to have to deal with one-parent households. So it's a really tough time for women during this period. We've added this iconic photograph from the Great Depression of a woman with her 3 kids. Her last name is Lang. And so it kind of shows the troubles that women have during this time period. And as if the Great Depression wasn't bad enough, in the Midwest, the Dust Bowl is going on. This is an ecological disaster that destroys livelihoods, farms, homes. All of this happens. What ends up causing it is our sod busters with their steel plow. Now, with the steel plow, they dig deeper into the earth to find water in the soil, and we start growing this Russian strain of wheat, and all of this farming had destroyed the topsoil on a lot of people's farms. And so what ends up happening is the topsoil is really loose. It's not thick, and it gets dried out. And so when windstorms come through the Great Plains, they pick up the topsoil, and that creates a dust storm. Dust storms can be completely black, and they become known as black blizzards. You can see a dust storm creeping over a town here in this bottom picture. Okay, it just rolls right in, and it gets to the point that you can't see the hand in front of your face. And you want to, if you walk outside, it's dark. Not only is it dark but all this dust is blowing around, and if you breathe it into your lungs, you're going to end up dying. So what happens to all the farmers from the Dust Bowl? It ruins a lot of land. They're going to uproot themselves, they're going to pile into cars, and they're going to head west to California from the Great Plains. The Grapes of Wrath, written by John Steinbeck, is about the story of the Okies, what the people from Oklahoma call themselves, who leave Oklahoma and move out west to find jobs. And it's about the plight of those in poverty, and it's a great book. If you haven't read it, you should add it to your list of books to read sometime in your life. It really shows the story of the Great Depression. I don't know if you guys read it in English class or not, but some classes do. So the Dust Bowl is a big issue. Now, for African Americans have about a 50% unemployment when whites have about 25%. Now, the 25% rate only represents those who are unemployed, that have no job. It's not those who are underemployed, which means people are working the same job as before, but for half of the wages that they used to get. Most people at this time continue to work for half wages. And you have about 15% of whites that are underemployed, plus the 25% unemployed. So in essence, half the country is doing poorly, and that's just the white side. African Americans have about 50% unemployment, and then about 15 to 20% underemployment. So the Great Depression is going to be really tough for African Americans. They're still dealing with segregation in all parts of the country, especially in the South. They're still dealing with lynching and Jim Crow laws and all that kind of stuff. So it's a really tough time for everybody, including African Americans. Now, one thing that does kind of come out of the Great Depression, it happens towards the end when we get to the war industries, is the Fair Employment Act, which is going to open up federal jobs to people regardless of race. And it's supposed to be gender too, but there are some issues with that. Now, African Americans had not done very well during FDR's presidency. That's one of the spots on his presidency that was not so good, as there were still lynchings in the past. They had tried to pass an anti-lynching law or attach it as an amendment to something, but Roosevelt had always shot it down because a large part of the Democratic base that voted for him was from the South, and they were racist and they didn't want black equality. So to secure their votes, Roosevelt ignored a lot of African American problems. However, his wife Eleanor did not ignore them. Eleanor was a champion and an advocate for minorities, for women, unemployed, for a lot of people. She's going to bring minorities to the White House to talk to FDR, and eventually, towards the end of his second term, he'll sign the Fair Employment Act, saying that federal jobs have to be open to anyone regardless of race. They cannot be segregated. Now, he does this because African Americans threatened to march on Washington with about 100,000 people, and he says, okay. We'll sign this. Eleanor is going to be especially significant because she says that she will stand up publicly with these 100,000 African Americans if he does not sign it, not just privately like FDR. So she's much more engaged in the Fair Employment Act for African Americans. Now, for Native Americans, if you remember the Dawes Act from the 60s, I believe, that put the Native Americans on acres of land, tried to make them farmers, took away their structure of tribes. That didn't work. So FDR agrees to sign the Indian Reorganization Act, which you need to write down. Indian Reorganization Act, which negates the Dawes Act, and it returns all of the land that had been divided up for families to the tribes. So tribes now live on the land. He grants the tribes autonomy, which means you can live however you want on your land. You're still on reservations, which is a sad thing, but you now have the ability to govern your tribe and your land as you see fit. And there are two reasons that they do this. The first is because the Native Americans are very unhappy with the Dawes Act, and second, because to enforce the Dawes Act, it required a lot of federal money. Federal money that A, we don't have at this time during the Great Depression in the 1930s, and B, if we take the money away from enforcing the Dawes Act, we can use it for other things. So it allows them their autonomy, it's cheaper, and it saves money during the Great Depression. It ends up being a good thing for Native Americans. Now, Mexican Americans, they had been encouraged to come across the border during World War I to work. And guess what? They're not encouraged anymore. And during the Great Depression, we're trying to get them to leave. They're competing with jobs for other Americans, white and African Americans, and we're going to deny them jobs. Our nativist ideas are re-emerging, and just like all of the minorities in the U.S., the Great Depression is not so good for them. And just like the rest of the world, Mexico is facing a depression during this time period, so it's not really good for anybody. So life is pretty tough during the Great Depression overall. Now, with the New Deal, we have a legacy of the New Deal. Most historians say that the New Deal was not the solution to the Great Depression, that FDR did not solve the Great Depression, but he did alleviate a lot of the problems. He did change government forever with his New Deal program. And there are arguments on the other side from the conservatives that FDR actually prolonged the Great Depression because he interrupted the normal business cycle, but that's a very minority view. Most historians don't agree with that. They agree that FDR helped with the New Deal. It didn't solve the problem, obviously, but it did help a lot of people. So, lasting effects of the New Deal are still around today. We have things like Social Security, unemployment insurance, we have the FDIC, all those financial reforms. A lot of these things are still around. They're going to be built upon. Lyndon Johnson is going to build upon Social Security with Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare is for the elderly, Medicaid is for the poor. Think of it as aid for the poor, care for the elderly, which is a health insurance for those over 65 and the very poor during the 1960s. The fight today is over healthcare reform and Obamacare, which would also be building upon the ideas of the New Deal. You can see in buildings signs like this that was built by Works Progress Administration. I know the courthouse here in Arlington was built by the WPA. I'm sure there are some things out in Vienna that were built. And then you can see, I thought this map was really cool, and I wish I could have gotten a bigger version, but you can see how there are things all across the country that were built by the New Deal. So it touched every single part of the country, not just one particular area or another, and that's kind of neat. So that ends chapter 33. Chapter 34 is going to start to get into the war. So we've got some discussion questions, which I would like you to answer at home, and then we will go over them. We'll probably watch a video clip in class just to kind of review this, our first day back, and then go through the discussion questions of chapter 33, and then jump into chapter 34. So which groups made up the new Democratic coalition that re-elected Roosevelt by a landslide in 1936? Why was each group attracted to the New Deal? And this might be help to answer through your textbook. Number 2, discuss the record of the New Deal on conservation and the environment. Number 3, discuss Roosevelt's court packing plan. Why did he propose it? Did he win or lose the fight to remake the Supreme Court, and why? Number 4, what caused the Roosevelt recession? What did the New Deal do to combat it? And number 5, what brought about the end of the New Deal in 1939? Another thing to remember is that it's probably a good idea to make a chart of the New Deal and all of the programs, because you need to know each program and what it did and whether it was relief, recovery, or reform. So you might want to make a chart of that as a good study technique, or do a word web or something like that to help you study and know that, because we will have a quiz on, I believe, 33, 34 a little bit after we get back. Thanks for watching. Have a great rest of spring break.